Authorities in Brussels are concerned that Russian disinformation could pose a challenge for some of the EU's smaller member states during this election period. Slovakia, in particular, has had to grapple with Moscow's influence operations for years now, as Alex Cadier reports from Bratislava.
Towering over the Slovak capital, a monument to the Soviet soldiers who died liberating the country from Nazi control during World War II. A symbol of the historic ties between Russia and this small Central European country. For 30 years after its independence from the Soviet Union in 1993, Slovakia charted a course towards the West. This year, the country marks 20 years of European Union and NATO membership. This direction has not gone unnoticed in the Kremlin. Slovak lawmakers and security officials say that for years, Russia has tried to exert its influence on Slovak society and Slovak politics. Before the last parliamentary elections in 2023, Slovakia's President Zuzana Kapitova warned that Russian disinformation spread primarily on social media was taking root and would lead to fragmentation and polarization across the country. But Moscow has denied spreading disinformation in Europe and instead accused the West of waging a full-scale information war. Yet recent studies suggest Kremlin narratives have become mainstream for some Slovaks. 51% of them blame the West and Ukraine for Russia's invasion. Just 41% blame Russia. Only 30% think Ukraine should join NATO or the EU, the lowest level of any European Union country. In the 2023 election, Slovaks went on to elect a Kremlin-friendly government and president, prompting a complete U-turn in the country's political direction. Its new Prime Minister, Robert Fico, cut all military support to Ukraine and said that Kyiv is under US influence and no longer sovereign. He's made efforts to mark Russian Memorial Days in Slovakia, including at the Soviet War Memorial in Bratislava. His government has also dismantled Slovakia's counter-disinformation unit, which had been debunking what it identified as Moscow's false narratives. The former chair of the Slovak Parliament's Defense Committee claims the reach of Russian propaganda is now growing under this government.
The Russian influence has been here since ever, but it's growing. It was growing through the disinformation media, during the time of the previous government. The most difficult thing is that to fight the disinformation and the Russian narrative is almost impossible without the government interference.
In this year's European election campaign, Prime Minister Fico's Smer party has framed Russia's invasion of Ukraine as being the result of Western provocation. Their coalition partners in government, the far-right Slovak National Party, are running the slogan, "We are not a buffer zone for Brussels." At a campaign rally in a venue part-funded by the European Union, Smer's deputy leader criticized EU policy in Ukraine and warned of an EU superstate which could order Slovak troops to war.
I don't want to have a future when some Brussels centrum will decide that my son will be a soldier in the war against Russia. I don't feel any hatred against Russia. Russians, they liberated us in the Second World War from fascism, and we cannot forget this. That's why I think that the most pragmatic way how to finish this war is to sit on the table and to have some peace settlement. It's not that we are pro-Russian. We don't agree with the political, this military action of Russia against Ukraine. We cannot agree.
But experts say Smer's talk of peace isn't rooted in the reality of this war.
The peace that they're talking about is the peace on Russian terms, which is completely opposite from what the Ukrainians want and are fighting for. And if Russia ends the war today, there will be no war. And if Ukraine ends the war today, there will be no more Ukraine. So I think we should listen to the Ukrainian leadership, to the Ukrainian people, consider the common values that Ukrainians are currently fighting for, and continue the support for Ukraine.
Despite the dramatic shift in the new Slovak government's rhetoric, most Slovaks still think their country's fortunes should be aligned with its Western allies. The big question now is whether or not membership of the European Union and NATO for Slovakia means enough safeguards have been put in place to mitigate against Russian intervention and influence on its democratic institutions. While experts worry about the impact of pro-Kremlin influence campaigns, it's voters here that will now have their say on whether to lean back on the country's historic Russian ties or continue to forge its future with the West. Alex Cadier, CNA, Bratislava.